Good morning, everyone. So welcome to today's webinar on climate risk and resilience in the UK brewing sector and the new research that we've just published on this. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Heather Gardner, Sustainability Policy Manager at the BBPA. And I am really excited to finally share this important piece of work with you. It's a key issue, not just for our sector, but for the wider supply chain as well. And if you haven't already seen it, I've dropped a link to the research in the chat, so you should be able to access it through there. This project is the result of collaboration between the BBPA and the Zero Carbon Forum with support from funding from the Brewers Research and Education Fund. We've brought in sustainability specialist 3Keel to carry out the research, and our goal was better understanding the scale of climate risks facing the brewing sector in the UK and how we can start tackling them together. Though, as you'll all be very aware, climate change is already impacting businesses worldwide through shifting weather patterns, rising temperatures, and changes in rainfall. And these changes pose real threats to supply chains and operations. For brewing, the risks are particularly acute because we rely so heavily on agricultural inputs like barley and hops, and crops that are directly exposed to changes in climate. This latest report is part of a broader project on climate risk and resilience, which we have been working on collaboratively for the last year or so. And the new report builds on some earlier phase 1 work, which we completed last year. This was a comprehensive materiality assessment of climate risks to the sector. And that initial research was funded by 21 businesses from both BBPA and Zero Carbon Forum membership, including global brewers, UK brewers, and pubcos. And you can see those funders on the screen now. It was a major first step, and it really demonstrated the sector's commitment to understanding and addressing climate challenges. Phase 1 identified drought, flooding, and extreme temperatures as the biggest threats to our key ingredients of barley and hops. So, in this next phase of work, 3Keel took a deep dive into those specific risks. And in today's session, we're joined by Emily Crowe and Luke Ryder from 3Keel, who will walk us through the key findings and recommendations. Finally, Bob Gordon from the Zero Carbon Forum will talk us through what's next and how we plan to take this research forward. So this is just the beginning of what we hope will be an ongoing collaborative effort to build climate resilience across our industry, our supply chains and beyond. There'll be hopefully lots of time for Q&A towards the end, but please do feel free to pop your questions into the chat at any time or raise your hand. So thank you again for joining us, and I'll hand over to Emily and Luke.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thanks, Heather. I'll just take the control if that's okay. There we go. Hopefully that's moving for everybody.
It is, yeah.
Perfect. Okay, great. So just to start with a bit of an outline of how our presentation is going to run today, we'll start off with some introductions. First of all, kind of just to 3Keel in general and also to Luke and myself. And then I will kick off into the climate risk assessment before handing over to Luke, who will go through the priority adaptation measures and some strategic sector recommendations before we wrap up with some conclusions and move on to the Q&A. So 3Keel. So just to give you a bit more background of who we are, we're sustainability advisors who specialise in working with clients in the food system. We support with kind of climate, nature and agriculture, amongst other practice areas. You can see from that diagram on the slide there that we work across a range of areas, but throughout the food system. So that gives us lots of great experience and insights throughout the entirety of the supply chain. I'm Emily, I'm a senior consultant and I work in our team, which focuses on climate, nature and resources. And then shortly I'll be handing over to Luke, who's also a senior consultant, but he specialises in agriculture and landscapes. And there is a third member of our team, Owen Smith, who was also critical to delivering this report, but she couldn't make it today, unfortunately. So the project itself, as mentioned, it was commissioned to focus on physical climate risk in the UK, looking at the UK brewing sector and identifying some actions to build resilience. But more specifically, its aims were to assess the expected severity and potential impact of the most material risks, which we've identified from the first phase as being the drought, temperature rise and flooding. Secondly, to identify effective adaptation interventions to build resilience against identified risks, before moving on to assessing the co-benefits of identified adaptation interventions, also looking at emissions and water and biodiversity, so taking a more holistic view, and finally developing some recommendations for the brewing sector as a whole, focusing on kind of collective action to mitigate those risks and building resilience moving forward. In terms of the structure of the report itself, we started by looking at those risks, which we identified as being most pertinent, before moving on to developing some critical adaptation measures. And then, as I mentioned, kind of aligning with that fourth aim, taking a step back and looking at the brewing sector as a whole with some sector-specific recommendations. We kind of identified the primary audience of this study to be UK brewing companies. However, of course, its findings aren't only relevant for UK brewing companies. There's also another whole host of other stakeholders which could derive a lot of benefit from it, including farmers, crop traders, even hospitality customers, and of course, policymakers. We also know that quite a few individual UK brewers have carried out their own risks. So the purpose of this project was to really raise that collective awareness through the evaluation at the sector level and to provide transparency and the common ground for joined up action moving forward. So moving on to the risk assessment itself. The initial stages were to understand where the majority of hops and barley used for brewing in the UK were coming from. I'm sure everybody attending here is very familiar with the sourcing profile for the brewing sector, but it's just kind of helpful to revisit as we move through the risk assessment, and primarily the difference between hops and barley. They have quite different sourcing profiles. Almost all malting barley is sourced from within the UK, whereas it's a slightly different picture for hops, with over 90% being imported from abroad and being imported from a range of different countries as well, but there are a few hotspots which we've looked at as well. The first stage was to look at the physical risk assessment. So we took a spatial approach here, and we did some physical risk mapping. For each of these, we created a series of maps using GIS and QGIS, which showed the kind of projected percentage change in each risk parameter. So that might be the percentage change in millimeters of rainfall or percentage change in average temperature, for instance. And we created these maps for both 2040 and 2080 to provide a kind of both medium and long-term view of what those climate projections were saying. All the maps that we created were using data that was under a global warming scenario of approximately 2.8 degrees of warming, which, if you're familiar, is RCP6. And that's kind of one of the recognized warming pathways that's published by the IPCC and recognized internationally as being one of the 4 potential future pathways that we are on the trajectory for. We later then kind of derived this one stage further, and we split the maps by season. So for here, you've just got an example of seasonal drought, because that enabled us to really develop insights that were aligned closer with the crop growing cycles. And also, it's kind of important to acknowledge that risks don't materialize consistently throughout the year, and that the risk of a risk is not consistent throughout a year. So taking both like a spatial and temporal approach enabled us to account for both the variation across space and time. And we ended up with some really specific hotspots to dig into a bit deeper. Before we go on to the actual results of the analysis, it's kind of quite an important caveat to know, and just to build a bit of understanding on the climate projections and the data that we use that sits behind all of this. We are using projections. They're not predictions. Models cannot predict the future, but they do provide a helpful kind of indication. And that point of it being a projection, not prediction, is really important to underscore, because there is complexity and there is uncertainty, and in particular climate scenario and risk modelling that is apparent. However, to mitigate that, we've used data from warming scenarios calculated by the IPCC. It is the best available source of these projections, and there's kind of where the most science and research has gone into. Despite this, it doesn't account for things like tipping points or feedback loops. There are more dynamic impacts that can't be predicted, such as societal or geopolitical shocks. So this is where the model shouldn't be really viewed as a precise forecast of future weather, but they're really valuable to understanding the risks and guiding action for mitigation. And one of the kind of best examples that I can describe this to you through is the difference between averages and extremes. So a lot of the data that we're going to present today is on averages, average increase, projected average increases, but that doesn't really prescribe the frequency or severity of extreme events in the future. We know there is a well-established link between these two things. The IPCC has published research that kind of indicates that with every 1 degree rise of temperature, so that's kind of a chronic average rise in temperature, the intensity of heavy precipitation increases by 7%. So there are links between averages and extremes, but it's very hard to model projected extremes, which is why we look at the average data, and then we add the layer of understanding that we know that it will impact the extremes more. And I think that's highlighted quite nicely in the graph that's on the slide. You can see here that a kind of slight increase in average mean, which may not look too alarming, actually then puts a lot more of the graph into that bucket of hot weather and record hot weather. So it's just these kind of shifting timescales and shifting data points, and just understanding a little bit more as to what's behind them. So going back to our assessment itself, the climate projections I was just discussing are critical to assessing risk severity. However, understanding specific crop vulnerabilities is kind of the other half of the equation when we're looking at a more holistic view of production risks. So to do this, we allocated a score of between 1 and 10, with 10 being the highest for vulnerability, to each crop and each hazard. And it's kind of summarized here on the table that's in the screen. You've got the risks in the far left-hand column and the crops along the top columns, and then the score and a little bit of a comment of why it's been allocated that score. You can see straight away that the risk of flooding scores the highest of both crops, with 8 and 9 respectively, and then drought scoring a little bit lower, kind of around the halfway mark for barley, and a little bit lower for hops. So then we took these two aspects together. We combined the physical risk mapping with the vulnerability scores, and then we created a matrix, that's one of which is shown on the screen here. This one's for barley, and that enabled us to view the risk to the UK sourcing profile as a whole and identify which regions were the greatest risks. So just to describe a little bit what's going on the graph here, you've got the risk severity from 1 to 10 up the y-axis, and that relates to the physical maps that I'm going to give you an example of in a minute. And then along the x-axis, you've got the vulnerability, which was the table I was just showing you. Then populated on the graph, you have a bit of a key. So you've got both risk and region being represented here. The region is the first two letters, and then the risk is the latter letter, so D for drought, F for flooding, etc. And then also what we've got on here is the sourcing volume. And using the sourcing volume overlaid with the risk factors means we can really clearly see hotspots developing, and understanding how these kind of multiple variables can come together to either exacerbate or lessen a risk. So here there's a very clear hotspot in the east of England. You can see they're circled in the navy kind of oval. You've got East Midlands, east of England, southeast, all scoring very high for both high temperatures and flooding. You've got multiple risks concentrated in one area, which is also represents a very high sourcing area. So that's a real key hotspot for us to focus on. And because of that, we've decided to draw this one out a little bit further, looking at a map of the risk of drought in the summer. So this is 2040. So this is our kind of medium-term view. The matrix I just presented is really beneficial to understanding those comparative risks. And then when we want to dive in a little bit deeper into specific hotspots, we can look at the maps, because the maps give us that seasonal element. So here we can specifically look at drought in the summer. And then that aligns with kind of critical periods in the growing cycle, such as, for spring barley, grain filling period happens during the summer. And if there's a drought there, it may reduce the yield or degrade the quality of the malting barley. So we can start to kind of put those pieces together, linking through from the risk to the crop vulnerability into the impacts, and then that will feed through into the adaptations as well. And I think we also have another example of hops. So just to kind of complete those two crops that we were looking at, the example we've decided to draw out for hops is for flooding. If you remember, flooding was very highly scored for hops when we looked at its vulnerability. So, and here we've got a bit, as we said before, kind of there's a bit of a different production regions for hops in comparison to barley. Barley is obviously grown throughout the UK, but concentrated in a few regions, whereas hops is like very regionally specific. And so to do that justice, we kind of did a slightly different approach to the mapping. And here on the map, you've got a map of flooding, but then really highlighted out those key regions of Herefordshire and Kent. Both counties are very big hop production counties. They also have mature rivers flowing through them. And also, as you can see here in the areas of dark green, they kind of correlate with the areas of high flooding risk. So it's a lot more of a local perspective here, which aligns quite nicely with the locality of hop production as well. And as we can see, kind of noted on the slide there, rainfall is expected to increase by over 10% in these regions. So that's quite a significant difference, which when you combine with the risk, that means when you combine it with the fact that there's some big rivers existing in those regions, the risk of generalized flooding, both from rainfall and river expansion, is further elevated. Plus, you could take on the vulnerability of hops. The fact that they have multi-year maturation times means that it might take longer to recover from a severe flooding event. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we did have a look at the international risks for sourcing hops. This was a slightly higher level assessment. We didn't produce any maps ourselves and looked at kind of published research and secondary data. We found that we looked all over the world, but more broadly at European and American hops as more like key hotspot areas for UK sourcing. We found that, kind of as expected, the key continental hop growing regions also face significant climate risks. More specifically, increasing occurrence and severity of droughts and heat waves was already having a detrimental impact on hop yield and quality. Looking ahead, these are likely set to worsen. Studies found that projected decline of hop yield of 4 to 18%. So again, quite a range. It's very regionally and country specific, but some quite large changes there. And that was by 2050. Those changes are highlighted in the table that's on the slide. The scale of the area and corresponding level of yield of loss expected. So the percent of the EU area that's at risk and how affected the yield loss might be. So for instance, 7.2% of EU growing areas are a risk of a very high yield loss. As well as looking at yield, we also had a look at the alpha acid contents, and this is something that drought and heatwave events also decrease, which can have an impact on the flavour profiles. Within the key EU growing regions, the alpha acid content of hops is predicted to decline between 20 and 31% by 2050. So again, quite significant. If we move to the States, it's a slightly different picture. So far, the Pacific Northwest hops have been relatively resilient to water stress, which is the biggest risk there. They use a lot more irrigation in the States than we do in Europe or the UK. So it's, the impacts haven't been materialized as of yet. However, looking ahead, it is projected to have quite significant changes in precipitation timing, and also when combined with competition for water, there's a lot of uncertainty around the future supply of irrigation, which then may cause the US to kind of fall into the same risks that the EU currently is. And even if the irrigation supply is continued to be confirmed, that may impact the price of hops. So just to summarize our key takeaways from the barley risk assessment today, we identified the East of England as a hotspot. It supplies over 65% of the UK brewing sector's malting barley, and that's at risk of compounding risks. So drought, heat stress, and flooding are all predicted to materialise in that region. There are some severe climate impacts in international barley growing regions, and it could have an impact on the global barley supply. And then that also has a knock-on effect on the proportion that's available for beer production. Extreme weather and global market instability are expected to increase the malting barley price volatility for UK brewers. And so taking all of this together, without swift adaptation, the UK brewing sector risks future malting barley shortages as land shifts towards food and animal feed production, and the area of land available to grow barley is reduced due to the materialization of some of these risks. Similarly for hops, has that changed? Yeah. The hop, as we noted, the hop production is a lot more concentrated in the UK than it is for barley, and those areas in specific face pretty moderate flooding and drought risk, although it does vary by location, particularly with autumnal precipitation increasing by 10% and spring rainfall declining by 7 to 12%. So you get kind of wider spectrum of dry periods, very dry periods versus very wet periods, and being able to adapt to both of those is another challenge when we look at this a bit more holistically. So the key international hop regions, such as the US and Germany, are increasingly vulnerable to drought and heat as well. Some impacts are already materializing, as we noted in the EU. And the specificity of hop varieties' flavour profiles limits brewers' ability to shift sourcing quickly. So that can have their knock-on impacts on price spikes and short-term supply issues, I suppose. So to echo the barley, without proper adaptation, we need measures like targeted breeding. The UK could expand hop production, and overseas regions, if they're becoming less viable, there's kind of scope there to make the UK a bit more kind of self-sufficient in this regard. And that's an area that we can explore a bit more later on. So that wraps up our climate risk assessment, and I will hand control back to Luke, who's going to take us on to the adaptation measures.
Thank you, Emily. Fingers crossed this works as I move it on. So yeah, so in the interest of time, we'll just move very swiftly on into the adaptation measures. So the research that we conducted very quickly identified 10 adaptation measures. These are agronomic measures that farmers potentially couldn't implement in order to build on-farm resilience. And I have to say they're directly in relation to the material climate impacts that Emily has just been alluding to. So if you're looking at these 10 adaptation measures, thinking there's nothing in there about fertilizer usage, there's nothing in there about synthetic fertilizers or ag chemicals or inputs on the farm, then you'd be right, because obviously this is directly, these are resilience measures which we think farmers can adopt that will directly help them combat, risk of drought, flooding, and higher mean temperatures. So we've grouped 9 adaptation measures under the headings of water management, climate resilient crops, and also soil health and regeneration. And we felt that they were quite nice groupings. There's a lot of interlinkages between these adaptation measures. It's worth saying as well that these are not necessarily new, they're not radical in some cases, and in many cases farmers are already adapting these types of approaches. They are starting to transition, for instance, towards regenerative agriculture. So this isn't sort of a catch-all list, it's quite broad list, but again, critical none the same. And very much underpinning the 9 adaptation measures is this idea of increased use of technology and monitoring. So precision agriculture, so things like direct drills, variable rate sprayers has been around for a long time, GPS guided tractors, etc. But what we're ultimately talking about here is much more sort of data, much more analytics, much more precise agriculture, sort of targeted applications, whether that be irrigation or whether it be some sort of chemical input. So we're talking about smart agriculture underpinning all the other adaptation measures. I'm not going to go through all 10 now. I think that would take far too long. So we've just picked out one adaptation measure per heading. The first one being under water management, and that being drainage. So many of you will be aware on the call, drainage infrastructure on a lot of UK farms predominantly was reliant on grant funding back in the 1970s and the 1980s. We're now talking about a much, a need to actually increase drainage infrastructure, reinvest in many cases for farms. The flood risk that's obviously been highlighted in the previous work is from rivers, but it's also from increased extreme weather events. We are obviously facing higher precipitation. We are seeing much more flooding, and therefore that's leading to prolonged wet and damp soil conditions, which obviously can impact root health and obviously also overall productivity. So this idea of taking a more proactive stance and actually impacting and investing in drainage is something we think is critical, and perhaps is a role that brewers and the supply chain can actually assist more with in the future, helping farmers invest in this particular area. The next one is around cultivation of drought, heat and tolerant varieties. And I have to say thank you to the likes of Charles Farram, but also our conversation with Magby. I know Julian's on the call, which was very much around the work that's already underway within the industry, within the sector, looking at breeding new varieties that will help combat drought and heat tolerance. So really critical area of work. I highlight the work of the James Hutton Institute, the International Barley Hub. Again, absolutely critical that this research is underway, but also that it's supported, is sponsored, and by the wider industry. One issue that we did highlight was a lot of DEFRA Innovate UK funding at the moment has to create some sort of intellectual property, which obviously means that a lot of funding from DEFRA and Innovate UK isn't at the moment directly applicable to plant breeding. So that's something, again, that needs to change, and it's something that perhaps the industry and the brewing sector at large can help support and can help sponsor as well. The next one is cover cropping. So again, I won't go into the details here, but again, it's a real solid cornerstone of regenerative agriculture. We're very much focusing here on soil health. Farmers, as I said earlier, are transitioning towards regenerative agriculture, but it does require a mindset change. It requires a mind shift, and that actually potentially could be something that brewers in the future might want to play a more active role in. And I know in certain parts of the UK and Europe, projects and pilots are already underway to help farmers, whether it be on the barley side or the hops, to start looking at new regenerative techniques to improve soil health. So again, this is already starting to build, but perhaps much more progress could be made if the industry really got behind it. And then the final one is this idea, as I said, of smart agriculture. So precision agriculture has been around, we understand those techniques, but I'm really talking here about sort of data-driven farming, so we can make more targeted applications, as I said earlier. So maybe greater use of satellite remote sensing, earth observation imagery, maybe much more greater use of IoT, so actually sensors within the field to monitor rainfall, to monitor soil moisture, getting much more smarter and much more targeted about how we actually farm, making much more informed decisions as farmers and growers, I think is something that's absolutely critical. Again, lots of work going on in this area. DEFRA, Innovate UK, also the likes of the UK Agritech Centre doing a lot of pilots, Harper Adams with their innovation centre. There's a lot of work going on in this area already. So as part of the project, we very quickly tried to introduce some sort of prioritization. Given the amount of variety between the adaptation measures, however, we found this quite challenging. I'll hold my hands up. So what we did is we broadly grouped them in terms of short term. So these are, it won't come as any great surprise, the sort of the more immediate measures that farmers could adopt, either in the current growing season or post-harvest into the next growing season. So around cover cropping, reduced tillage, integrated pest management, more species diversity. The medium-term ones are we're starting to climb in terms of the cost scale, but once these investments are made, they are strategic and potentially could help productivity for years to come. So those would be around sort of investing in irrigation infrastructure, rainwater harvesting, precision agriculture, and as I said, IoT. So again, there are potential opportunities there. And then finally, the longer term is this idea around sort of the higher cost. Perhaps this is not directly within the gift of brewers or farmers, but these are plans that can be put in place and the industry and the brewing sector can get behind and support. So the main one being, as I said, really ramping up increased breeding techniques and also potentially helping farmers invest with drainage and infrastructure on farm. So again, drainage is something that we do keep coming back to as part of this process. So that's the adaptation measures. As I said, there was 10, but that was just a quick whistle-stop tour through the key 4. I'll now move into the strategic sector recommendations. So what we're talking about here is increasing, I guess, the a more unified sector approach towards collaboration. We're talking about looking at some of the financial support mechanisms that are currently available but actually might need to be available in the future. I'll do a quick deep dive into the landscape approach and what I mean by that in terms of collaborative funding of large-scale sustainability at a landscape function, where perhaps the brewing sector and members might want to get much closer to the landscape at large and work with collaborative partners. We'll talk about a little bit about sort of R&D and some of the work there, but we've already touched upon that. And then finally, I'll sort of touch upon some broader key policy enablers. So the research as we went along through conversations, as I said, with the likes of Charles Farram and Magby and producers on the ground, it was quite critical that some of this is out of the control, the immediate control and the immediate power of the industry and the sector itself. So we also produced a list of policy enablers, which we feel are almost critical asks, if you will, of government, and where perhaps government support could help unlock, be it financial or be it regulatory pressures that are currently being felt by the industry. So the first one is around improving sourcing traceability. And really what we're talking about here is getting much closer to the supply chain, actually being able to influence what goes on down predominantly towards the farm gate. So this is around dedicated supply groups, producer pools, streamlining the actual supply chain itself in order to ensure a consistent supply of quality traceable raw materials. And I think it's this collaboration and actually getting closer to the farm gate, which is absolutely critical and unlocks the ability to influence what's going on farm. It will influence the ability to make those practices more sustainable. And actually, there is a sort of real sort of sense of shared responsibility that could be built between brewers, supply chain actors, but also the farmers and the growers, very much at the grassroots level. So this is a fundamental shift, and again, it's already underway in some circumstances, but we feel that this holds real potential for the future. It's supply chain collaboration. The next one was this idea around a landscape approach. So we at Three Keel are heavily involved. We help establish something called LENS, which is the Landscape Enterprise Networks. Essentially, what we're talking about here is all supply chain actors, be that local authorities, be it water utility companies, energy companies, perhaps along with organisations, large corporations who might have a sourcing region or a sourcing dependency from a certain part of the United Kingdom, could come together and actually collaborate around investing in sustainability and resilience at a landscape scale. So you could have a lens set up in the Southwest Lakes, in the Lake District. You could have lens, for instance, that are already set up in East Yorkshire, in East Anglia, in Cambridgeshire, etc. So we're looking at this in a much larger scale, and actually there's a real opportunity here for brewers and the brewing sector to actually start looking at potentially producing its own actual lenses. So one natural one that I can think of off the top of my head would be, for instance, hops. We know that there's only a few hop growers left in the United Kingdom, centred around sort of Kent and Sussex, and also up in Worcestershire, Herefordshire. So perhaps we could actually have lens that actually target those specific areas at a landscape scale. So again, I won't go into this, but essentially that's just a diagram that shows that lens is very much a demand-led approach. So this is all about looking at what businesses, what organisations have dependencies within a given landscape, and then looking to marry that with potentially what farmers and landowners and land managers can actually deliver. And that might be tree planting, it might be water quality, and actually for those who are responsible for abstracting water, etc. So lots of potential here to sort of come together as an industry and work with other supply chain actors and actually increase resilience at a landscape scale. I think the final one I'll just cover off very quickly is around sort of increasing R&D. So again, we've touched upon this quite a lot in terms of crop-specific breeding programs. But ultimately what we're talking about here is sort of more on-farm pilots. We're talking about sponsoring, getting on board with what is essentially the future and actually what could be invested in on an industry basis. And potentially, again, there's a lot of work ongoing in this area, but real critical to the future is to make sure that we're sponsoring the right type of research for hops, for malting barley, and making sure that we are resilient as a result. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through these, and hopefully those of you who are on the call have had a chance to look at this. But again, as I said earlier, key policy asks essentially of government are very much around increasing funding for plant breeding, on-farm infrastructure. We did speak to some producers, and we know from our other research that actually investing in on-farm infrastructure, particularly around water storage, on-farm water tanks, small on-farm reservoirs, can be extremely difficult in the current environment, particularly around EA and water abstraction licenses as well. So farmers feel constrained by the bureaucracy of the time, the red tape as they like to call it. So that again is something that potentially we need to be calling for as a sector, potentially aligning ourselves with asks from the likes of HDB or from the National Farmers Union of England and Wales. This idea around scaling up public-private collaboration in R&D. So again, looking for these examples of where there are existing initiatives where perhaps there is government funding available, but actually if the sector was providing a unified voice, then potentially it could unlock some of that funding on behalf of the industry. More public-private partnerships is something that I know the government's extremely keen on at the moment. There is this idea around calling upon highlighting the brewing sector's existing leadership in sustainability, and the BBPA's work on Brewing Green is something that we highlighted as part of the report. And then finally, the final two are around, we've already touched upon this, but expanding financial mechanisms. So this is this idea of creating more certainty. At the moment, there's a lot of uncertainty on farm level, particularly with what's happening with ELMS and SFI. This idea of potentially making more money available for farmers to start transitioning towards, for instance, regenerative agriculture, nature-friendly farming, and also this idea around sourcing visibility. So getting much closer to the farm gate, and actually potentially government have a role to play in that as well in terms of clearer labelling, etc., and government funding. So just as some very quick conclusive remarks, so going back to what Emily said about the material climate risks, which we know are already impacting. So they are already impacting the ability for farmers, both in the UK, but also further afield in an international perspective. They are already trying to face up to the impacts of worsening drought, floods and extreme heat. We know from a hops perspective that flooding, as I said, is becoming an increasingly greater risk. We know that there are issues around substitution with certain varieties. We know with malting barley that there's having to be a lot more blending going on. Farmers are missing the malting spec from year after year. And that's a situation that's going on in Europe as well, where farmers are increasingly turning away from certain barley varieties because they actually can't achieve the yield or the malting specification. And so after a couple of harvests, they effectively drop that particular variety, which might be a critical ingredient for a certain variety of beer. So we've got this situation developing where the impacts are already being felt. The UK, however, I think the research highlights that the UK will be favourable and will carry on being quite favourable in the circumstances, but only if resilience is actually built in now. And I think there's a real opportunity to, as I said, work with barley growers and hop growers here in the UK to actually look at what the next 10, 20, 30 years entails. This around urgent action needed for on-farm adaptation to rapidly protect future supply. And this idea around collective sector response. So the brewer engagement, farmer support and shared investment are critical to absolute success. The policy we've just talked about, and then finally the traceability and finance. So this idea of improving farm level traceability and creating sector-wide financing mechanisms, we believe is to be a critical step. Finally, I just was going to make this point around what the research has really thrown up is that actually as a supply chain, we must come together, we must collaborate. And this idea of sort of the old business as usual, very transactional relationship potentially has to come to an end. And actually we need to sort of create a much more greater sense of shared responsibility within the sector at large. Thank you very much. I think I might pass back now to Heather or to Bob possibly.
Thanks, Luke and Emily. That was brilliant. I just wanted to open it up now, see if there was any questions from anyone. There's a lot to take in. I appreciate it.
We just allowed your microphones as well. So if you want to jump in, then please just unmute yourself. And then if you could also do a little introduction before you ask your question, that would be great. Julian.
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much for the session and inviting us all to the webinar. The question was, I put it in Q&A actually, but has there been any feedback from government relating to the report? Because government need to be supportive of obviously R&D in the farming sector, and there's I mean things like closing off of the SFI scheme and so on is contra to where we need to be going really. I just wondered if government had had any sort of opportunity to come back to you with anything.
Not as yet, but our intention is to use our kind of Brewing Green initiative and set up some kind of detailed engagement with them very shortly and over the summer. And we will obviously keep you informed with anything we get back from them.
Julian, we've also used the report recently to respond to DEFRA's land use consultation as well, and the report is linked and referenced in that too. So it may be that we get something back from them via that route too.
That's great.
Thanks, Julian. Did anybody else have any questions at all? Appreciate there's quite a lot to take in.
Shall I ask another question, Steve?
Yeah, feel free, Julian. Absolutely.
Yeah, obviously one of the enablers there is plant breeding, and the speeding up of plant breeding because the changes that are required are much faster than the current traditional breeding techniques will sort of accommodate. So obviously, I mean, the precision breeding bill is going through House of Lords next Monday, so that's its final stage. That should be law with it. That should all come into law within the sort of final quarter of the year. So what? Obviously, the acceptance of gene editing and other precision breeding techniques is paramount to being able to implement that on a commercial basis. So is there any, I mean, we're customer driven in malting in terms of what customers want. So there needs to be acceptance within the consumer base of gene editing. Is there any, and I guess this question is really sort of pitched towards BBPA in a sense, is there any feeling that there will be resistance to the end customer? And we don't want to go down the GMO line that we've sort of fallen foul of in the past, but it's so important for the adaptation to have those new genetic techniques. But obviously, we're customer driven.
Yeah, and it's a great question, Julian. And I think I mean we don't really have any great sense of what consumers are currently sort of feeling around that as an approach. I think there's been a natural reticence or a sort of concern around genetic techniques as far as breeding programs are concerned. But I mean, if you look at the hop sector, for instance, there's an enormous amount of work going on at the moment using genetic markers as a way to speed up the breeding program and identify variants that have desirable characteristics faster than we could do using just traditional cross breeding techniques. So I think it's one of these things we will probably just have to explore as we go. But I agree. I think the opportunities for using genetic techniques to improve the speed of breeding is, it's a very important tool. But as you say, it has to be balanced against what consumers understand and accept. Luke, did you have something you wanted to bring in on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think the research, when we were conducting it for both hops and barley, very quickly threw up the potential that obviously plant breeding has currently and into the future, particularly around, as I said, heat and drought tolerance, etc. And we were made aware, particularly through the work of Charles Farram, around some of the breeding work that they're doing. I think there is this real secondary concern, almost, if you will, around there's huge potential there within modern plant breeding and future plant breeding techniques. However, there is almost this element of market acceptability, this idea of adaptation, adopting new varieties, the taste profile, for instance, the behavior, the characteristics that it imparts. So what is the market willing to ultimately adopt? And sometimes substitution isn't necessarily always available, and I think it does hamper in some cases their ability to adopt new varieties. I think there does need to almost be a bit of an opening up. There needs to be a much more sort of collaborative approach, and there needs to be getting more involved in that plant breeding, more that idea around these new varieties are coming, but actually are the industry willing, is the industry in a place where it's willing to actually adopt them and actually support the adoption of them? So again, I think that's something that I would urge the sector at large, is to very much get a lot closer to what's going on in terms of plant breeding and see where there's opportunities perhaps to sponsor and get on board with it.
Thanks, Luke. Mark, you've got a question.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the presentation. Really, really insightful. I guess then, just looking at the interventions that we're going to be requesting of the farmers, and Luke, I think you mentioned a number of them are already happening in terms of transitioning to regenerative practices. What do we see the barriers from our supply chain being to implementing a lot of the initiatives we've suggested? Is it just that consistent ask from them? I'm mindful we're doing that sort of thing in other aspects of the supply chain. So, yeah, just what is there enthusiasm from the farming supply chain to do some of these adaptation measures, and how can we accelerate that, I guess? Is it just collaboration?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, yeah, so a lot of when we're talking about building future resilience for barley and hops, and I'll focus here on the UK predominantly to begin with. Obviously, naturally, the adaptation measures are on farm. That is ultimately where, that's the coal face in this instance. That is where the biggest impact can be realised. And therefore, there is this sense that then the obligation and the dependency relies and sits with the farmer, and it's for the farmer to implement and to transition to more sustainable practices. I think that sense of just saying to a farmer and growers, you must become more sustainable and we want to see you transition to a regenerative future. For example, I use regenerative farming because at the moment this is very much the hot topic of the day. But it obviously, again, it's really prudent that farmers get on board with it and invest in these new techniques. But the challenges is around the yield gap, the challenges around adaptation and the risks that come with transitioning perhaps your farming practices, which you've become accustomed to for the last couple of decades. And so simply saying to farmers, you must now become more sustainable and these are the types of measures we want to see you adapting and adopting on farm, comes essentially with a whole lot of cost and risk associated potentially with that. So this idea of helping and assisting farmers to transition is a really key element, and it came out of the research very much front and centre. So that's hence why this idea around collaboration and supply chains and producer groups and getting this greater sense of brewers having a much greater role on what happens beyond the farm gate and perhaps knowing who your suppliers are. It's not about knowing who their names and date of births are. It's about essentially being able to actually have an influence and want to have an influence on what's going on farm, rather than, as I said, what was probably a more traditional sort of procurement perspective, which is we're just sourcing a commodity, we want it as cheap as possible, and perhaps as long as it turns up and as long as it's of sufficient quality, then that's fine. And I think now there is, across all sectors, we do a lot of work with Diageo and McCain's, and we do a lot of work with Asahi, both Europe and globally. There is a much greater sense now that actually we need to, as a supply chain, come together, work together, and actually help farmers adopt and adapt to many of these practices. So that's the key message, I think, really out of the adaptation measure. It's not, for instance, this idea of we're starting from a blank slate. A lot of farmers are already several steps down this journey, but there are ultimately farmers who have yet to take that first step, whether because of lack of finance, whether because of lack of confidence, and potentially they need support in order to make the jump. Thank you.
Jess, you've got a hand up.
Yes, hi there. I'm Jessica from Punch Pubs & Co. I'm very interested in your topic, a conversation around collaboration, because we're obviously a pub company and we're a little bit further down the supply chain. So I'd be very interested to understand how we could potentially support. I feel like it's going to be quite monetary. If you can have other examples as well, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so naturally, when we start to talk about supply chain collaboration, and some of our slides do allude to this, we start talking a lot about sort of financial incentives, premiums. As long as there was just more money in the system, then potentially farmers would be incentivized to become more sustainable, for example. I think there's a lot of existing initiatives that actually the industry could collaborate with, piggyback on, if I can use that term, because actually there's a lot of momentum already building in terms of looking at supply chain resilience. So there was already pilots, there's projects, there's research initiatives going on. Farmers increasingly through like the Hop Farmers Growers Association are coming together. They're already running their own pilots. You've got things like the SCI platform who've got their Regenerating Together framework. So there are initiatives both here in the UK and over particularly on the continent that are actually seeing farmers come together and actually start to coordinate a response in order to move towards more sustainable practices. And there's potential opportunities for the industry to align itself with those existing initiatives and sort of build on that progress. So we're very rarely starting, as I said, from a blank sheet of paper, or we're very rarely starting from scratch. There will also be examples within the UK of, for instance, people like Camgrain, Openfield, who again will have their own existing initiatives where they'll be working with groups of farmers. What you often find is it's very sort of small groups of farmers, dozen here, 2 dozen there, who are looking at producing a pilot or looking at changing their farming practices. But actually what we need is a more sort of cohesive, collective, unified response from the entire sector. But We've talked a lot as a project group around what the industry potentially could do in order to coordinate a response, because often what we find is that there's lots going on, supply chain initiatives here and there, but actually we're not always fully aware of what's going on. So perhaps there is a need to sort of make sure we're all coming together to avoid duplication of effort as well. That's something that comes through very strongly.
I think this leads quite nicely into what I was going to say now, Jess, but I think to get to it, one of the things we've learned in the work we've done with the forum is that there's lots of appetite and enthusiasm for getting straight to the exciting, sexy, collaborative project that gives us a good story, that maybe gives us something we can pat ourselves on the back for, or something that genuinely makes some progress. But what we know is there's a whole load of work that sits before that to understand exactly what's the problem we're trying to solve, exactly who's invested in solving it, what levers do we have available to us, clarity and consistency in the way that we're going to approach it, building the right tools to enable that we do it properly so that we can get a long-term sustainable result rather than just having a nice little pilot project that maybe works under certain conditions but doesn't work when you then try and broaden it out to the whole sector. Yes. Is that a good opportunity, Steve, Heather, for me to just jump straight into what I was going to say as well about the collaborative piece?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, great. Okay, I've taken control on the slides, so hopefully I can move them forwards. Before I do that, just firstly to say thank you, 3Keel, for doing that assessment, the risk assessment, recommended interventions. That's, I think, a fabulous and important piece of work. Thanks as well to BBPA for partnering with us on it, and to everyone who contributed at the first phase. We had 21 pub and brewing companies contribute phase one, and then of course thanks to the worshipful company of brewers and the Brewers Research and Education Fund who funded this particular piece of work. If I can move on, hopefully you can see that change then. So I just want to set up the next steps. We want to avoid this becoming a report that sits on a shelf and gathers dust. And exactly as Luke says, one of the very clear messages from the report is that collaboration is essential. I've shared here just a couple of quotes from the report that really highlight it. So supply chain resilience relies upon urgent collective action from the UK brewing sector. The most effective response requires collective action across growers, brewers and policymakers. Driving change upstream on farm relies on a unified approach across UK brewers. So we're keen to get all of those building blocks in place before we necessarily move straight to a project on farm. What I would say here, and what we've learned in the work we've done with the forum over a quite a long period of time, is that effective collaboration isn't a given, and it's not easy. We've been working with hospitality and brewing sector for 15 years now, and I think writing the report's the easy bit. The hard yards are very much in front of us. Actually getting ourselves together to understand exactly what we're going to do, get the right systems and the right framework in place to enable us to do it is a job. There are some hard yards in front of us. But the value of this report, I think, is that it provides us with those foundations. It gives us the platform to build upon. It tells us where our fundamental issues are in our supply chain that pose the biggest threats to brewing. It provides us with a suite of adaptation measures that enable us to say, right, which of these 10 are our priorities, how are we going to go about doing them? And then, of course, recommendations for action and policy. So we've identified the things that we need to be most worried about. We've identified how we can address them. And I think this report does that brilliantly. Please share it with your teams internally, with your leadership teams, your brewing teams, your purchasing teams. And let's get this kind of embedded within the sector as a good foundational step that brings us all to the same page. So finally from me is the next step, which is to come together to set up a forum, a coalition, to develop a unified understanding and approach that genuinely builds some long-term resilience. We know that needs to involve the major UK brewers, but it also needs to involve the wider value chain. And we will set up a further discussion to unpack what that's going to look like. That will involve, obviously, everybody who's involved at the first stage, as well as that wider supply chain collaboration. And then we'll get cracking, and we'll get this problem solved. I think that's all I wanted to say.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bob. Jess, your question.
Yes, just a quick question on this forum. Will it also include how we're going to be responding to government on this as well, not just how we can collaborate as an industry?
I think this. Sorry, Steve, go on.
No. I was just going to say I think that's almost certainly an element of that work too.
Yeah, I was going to say the same. It's exactly that kind of thing, Jess, that we need to get straight before we run into on-farm pilots. Let's really understand our scope and our terms of reference, who we're going to involve, knowingly bringing everybody from across the value chain together, and that would include those actors like government who have such a huge influence over it.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Emily, Luke, Bob, Steve, and everyone who joined today. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and as Bob said, we've got lots of work to do, but we will be in touch with all of you about the next steps in the coalition. If you've got any other questions you think of, or you want to learn more, or you want to have a more detailed discussion about any part of the research, just get in touch with one of us, and we'll be really happy to talk you through it again. Yeah, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Great session. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.